At various points last year, would-be coloniser of Mars, Elon Musk, addressed the population question. Not to join the folks arguing that we might be on the brink of an overpopulation crisis, instead to say this.
There are not enough people. I can't emphasize this enough. There are not enough people. And I think one of the biggest risks to civilization is the low birth rate and the rapidly declining birth rate. It is, and yet so many people, including smart people, think that there are too many people in the world and think that the population is growing out of control. It's completely the opposite. Please look at the numbers. If people don't have more children, civilization is going to crumble. Mark my words.
We can't see the future, so we can't know for sure who's wrong and who's right. But what are the arguments? Should we be worrying about population more? And if so, from which side? Well, let's have a look. In my later childhood, as I began to discover science fiction, one of the novels I read was a book by John Brunner called Stand on Zanzibar. Indeed, I still have it on my shelves today. The context of the book is the consequence of overpopulation, and the title came from the early 20th century suggestion that the world's population could fit onto the Isle of Wight if they were all stood shoulder to shoulder. But since the population had grown so much since then, you would now need a larger island, Zanzibar, at 221 square miles to accommodate the number. Now that was in 1968, mind, when the book was published. Since the population has more than doubled since then, we would have to collectively move to somewhere like Rhodes Island in the Aegean Sea at 540 square miles to pull this off today. There's no doubt we have a more crowded planet than we've ever had before. The question is whether it's become too crowded, soon to become too crowded, or, as Elon Musk says, really still a bit empty. And how much should we fear the direction of travel? Because while in aggregate human numbers continue to grow, we are seeing major changes. In the world's two most populous nations, China and India, both have reported fertility rates below 2.1, which is the replacement rate. Below that number, your population is declining. And in the US, the birth rate is 1.7 and has been heading down for some time. The UK 1.65, the EU 1.53. This trend has been in place for some time, but may have increased in the West, may have done, due to anxiety for the future. Financial services giant Morgan Stanley, in a note to investors last year, said that the movement to not have children owing to fears over climate change is growing and impacting fertility rates quicker than any preceding trend in the field of fertility decline. Since the trend is long established, you can't count out the possibility that that's more to do with people rationalising what they intended to do already, but for whatever reason it's clearly happening. But if it comes to total population numbers, you have to start with the question, how many people is too many? I mean, there has to be a line. I mean, if the human race grew to the point where if it had to stand shoulder to shoulder on every inch of dry land available, I think we could agree that that would be too many. And that's an absurd proposition, but it demonstrates that obviously there is a line. The question then is, where is the immovable end line that however great we become at being efficient in our use of resources, nevertheless across that line we cannot go. At least not without realising Elon's dream of colonising Mars. Some refuse to accept any suggestion that there can be too many at all. Look at all the doommongers of the past, they say, who predicted calamity and were proven wrong by history. Thomas Malthus was the first of the oft-quoted doomsayers, of course. In 1798, he wrote his essay on the principles of population, where he argued that a nation's food production improved the well-being of the population, but because of the growth in human numbers that resulted, the benefits would eventually be wiped out, because humans would tend to grow their numbers beyond the new capacity that had been added. He said populations tend to grow until the poorer segments of society suffer hardship, famine and disease, the Malthusian catastrophe. That would mean humanity would not be able to progress towards what he described as a utopian society, because such progress would always be undermined. He's often described as having been wrong because there was no imminent catastrophe, as the Industrial Revolution came along with the injection of energy-dense fuels courtesy of fossil fuels and massively increased food productivity. Until recently, you would have said he was right about one thing, though, because that situation, as he predicted, saw commensurately massive population growth. It went from a relatively slow-growing norm to utterly breathtaking, astonishing increases. But the recent switch to declining birth rates in most countries certainly does make him wrong, as does the increasing prosperity that we've seen. Now, utopias don't exist, but how we live today would certainly have seemed so by the standards of Malthus's day, a fact that our spoilt generation often fails to appreciate. More recently, we've had people like environmentalist Paul Ehrlich. Ehrlich is famous for the 1968 book co-authored with his wife Anne, The Population Bomb, which predicted imminent catastrophe. And it famously said this: in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. Amongst other things, it argued for population control, including soft forms of coercion, such as the use of tax benefits or withdrawal if voluntary methods didn't work. That potential catastrophe didn't emerge because, once again, we found ways to increase food productivity, particularly in India with the Green Revolution. All that has left us with a rather impoverished discourse. On the one hand, the critics of any idea of constraints on economic progress and human numbers point to these past pronouncements and make the argument that because those people were wrong in the past, such arguments must necessarily always be wrong in the future. That human ingenuity is a perpetual get-out-of-jail-free card that will always turn up in times of need. Now, that is a fact-free assertion. It doesn't require you to analyse the current situation, just kind of indulging in blind faith. On the other hand, the doomsters simply shrug off those previous misfires and argue that while the location of the line may have been pushed back, it is only delaying the inevitable. Accuse us of crying wolf, they say, but don't forget that in the fable there was indeed a wolf who eventually made his appearance. And Paul and Anne Ehrlich remain the principal figures making this case today. In the book Population, Agriculture and Biodiversity, they contributed the opening essay, in which they say this, drawing an unfavourable comparison between our situation today and how it was in 1968. The human predicament is now much more serious, since the human population has more than doubled in size, key resources are much more depleted, and environmental deterioration is substantially more advanced. The evidence today suggests that levels of hunger and malnutrition, though reduced since 1968, will likely increase as the human population grows, climate change advances, and biodiversity, a critical part of civilization's life support systems, is rapidly degraded. A perfect storm of environmental problems now threatens to lead to a collapse of civilization. The central issue, they argue, remains that of the ability to feed people. With the countries that are still seeing significant rapid population growth, the 7.7 billion people today is likely to grow by another 2 billion by 2050. With a significant amount of food poverty still to be eliminated, they point to analysts who estimate that food production would need to double in order to properly feed 10 billion people, expected by 2050. This situation, they argue, is laying the groundwork for future conflict. Nations like China, India, South Korea and Saudi Arabia are buying land in Africa, Brazil and other developing nations, at least partially in an attempt to ensure that their own populations will be fed as the food situation tightens. They are anticipating a time sometimes described as peak soil, when population size and growth make fertile and well-watered land a premier resource for investment. An analysis of the global land trade network found, ominously, that the structure of the network is potentially prone to propagating crises, e.g. if importing countries become dependent on crops exported from their land trading partners. The Ehrlichs argue that the approaching end of the fossil fuel era will itself make collapse much more likely. meaning that what they describe as humane population shrinkage has become an imperative. They describe the current belief in economics that insists on the desirability of unending economic growth as faith-based for what they say is its detachment from physical realities. And that's where I expect they filed Elon Musk's recent comment. For example, a recent mantra of faith-based macroeconomics is that birth rates must be increased to prevent a population from aging, having a growing proportion of elderly people, raising the worry that there will be too few workers to support pensioners. This idea is especially common amongst European politicians who do not realise that only the impossible, keeping the population growing forever, could prevent the population from aging unless highly immoral and socially unacceptable policies were employed, e.g. euthanasia. Insofar as it goes, and notwithstanding Elon's objections, that much is unarguably true. At some point, the population stabilises, and unless it did so because life has gone back to being nasty, brutish and short, then as it does, you will have an ageing population. If you can't figure out how to be prosperous in that situation, then you have a problem. But then the Ehrlichs take aim at another target, and that target is, well, people like me. Equally perverse and pervasive is the so-called demographic transition theory, which says economic development will automatically cause birth rates to decline to match lower death rates and eventually result in a constant population size. There's a bit more to it than meets the eye here, but before we get into that, I absolutely hold my hand up here. My own example of bias to be exposed, acknowledged, and then subjected to the test of the evidence. Because, let's face it, it would be an elegant and thankful outcome if we achieved the right balance just in time. If all we need to do is to bring societies out of poverty, which we want to do anyway, and in so doing, their population growth slows and then ends, and we then have to find a way for the 10 or 11 billion that we then have to live sustainably and prosperously on a finite planet. Nobody needs to be coerced to do anything. No population control policies needed whatsoever. No planetary ecosystem collapses. We just let natural processes take their course and it all works out fine. That may still turn out to be the case, but it's true to say that there is no supporting evidence to guarantee that that happens at the levels that by sheer coincidence turn out to be sustainable. There's no guarantee that we don't grow past a limit beyond which nature delivers a fairly brutal period of correction, above and beyond what our proud modern systems can be resilient to. And we've seen that sort of process in nature. When humans in North America hunted wolves to local extinction, the deer that they used to prey on no longer had their population kept in check by the wolves, and they boomed, so much so, in the end, that the plants, the trees, the shrubs, flowers and the grass that they ate became exhausted and the deer starved. When it comes to humans, there's also no evidence that says that it's inevitable. But simply hoping for the best isn't a risk management strategy. So we should at least engage with the question, where are the lines, how close to them are we? None of this is straightforward, because it does seem that the Ehrlichs are actually taking aim at a simplified theory that argues that economic progress itself single-handedly delivers those benefits. Historically, a widespread decline in death rates occurred in conjunction with industrialisation, followed by a decline in birth rates, but the causes of these patterns are complex. Meanwhile, thanks in part to economic growthmanship, much too little has been done in many parts of the world to remove barriers to family planning, which clearly facilitates low fertility rates and provides many other benefits. Okay, but you see, I would have said that one of the benefits of economic development is that generally, unless a religious restriction exists, economic prosperity translates into greater access to birth control and families able to make rational choices based on their circumstances. I suppose if you're going to separate those two, economic success and control over fertility, then yes, you can argue about cause and effect. I'm not sure why that's especially needed or productive. Central to the Ehrlich's case is that rising human numbers is coming side by side with declining resources. Even if you ignore any imperative to reduce fossil fuel use because of climate change, they make the case like this. The faith-based economic system further ignores that many, if not most, resources are scarcer and less accessible in 2018 than they were in 1968. A classic example of declining EROI, which is energy return on investment, is obtaining oil. The first oil well went down some 69.5 feet from the surface to hit oil in Pennsylvania in 1859, while the Macondo well that blew up in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010 was drilled beneath a mile of water and struck oil nearly 2 miles below the sea floor. A more dramatic example is that when people first started using metal, essentially pure copper was lying around on the surface in places like Cyprus, while today copper is mined in some cases at a depth of more than a mile, and for ores that contain less than 1% copper. That is a fair point, and one that is largely invisible to consumers and politicians who just see that there's oil and copper around without really being aware of the physical basis and the cost of how these things are obtained. We're rather more aware of things like rare earth metals, where we have a high strategic interest and we're competing directly against others, such as China and Russia, for those supplies, which then just kind of underlines their point. Still, the opponents of the likes of Paul Ehrlich would argue that the human race has shown time and time again that it can get more from less and it can expand the boundaries that are supposed to constrain us. So what's the actual situation where Ehrlich looks at the current state of consumption and resources and applies this overlay of maximum gloom? The optimists look at the pace of past innovation and airily express conviction that this is an endless process. Well, we need to be a bit more specific than that. Most of the best agricultural land was already under cultivation by 1960. Since then, agronomic and genetic improvements have pushed yield growth from that land beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Particularly recent genetic modification to enable crops to resist pest and herbicides, along with GPS-guided precision farm machinery. These developments have pushed yields up further in ways that actually decrease environmental impact. Today, we have a global food production system which produces enough food to meet the world's needs. So much food that it's widely believed, at least in rich countries, that if less food could be wasted and more could be effectively distributed, there would be no hunger in the world at all. Which may be true, but it's not entirely been the reality. When the food price crisis of 2008 hit, there were food riots in more than 30 countries. We are seeing challenges to the complacent assumption that growth just keeps on going. The strong increases in agricultural productivity seen across the second half of the century are shrinking, even turning negative in some parts of the world. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise. We do know all about the principle of the laws of diminishing returns. There's only so much you can do with a fixed amount of land. This study by Ray et al. In 2013 posited that the yield trends we're currently seeing, positive as they may be, are nevertheless not sufficient to achieve that doubling of yield by 2050, meaning that unless the rate changes or population growth slows sooner than expected, we will cross that line within the coming decades. You also need to factor in some of the apparently ideologically driven policies that may make this worse. So, for instance, the European Union deciding to set a target of 25% of its agricultural land to be farmed organically, a method that will reduce the land's productivity. It's worth remembering that famines in the 20th century were almost exclusively caused by bad policy rather than by droughts or other natural events. We have reached constraints that it's much harder to bargain with. We have as much land as we're likely to have, because even though some is added through the regrettable destruction of tropical forests, existing arable land also gets taken out by urbanisation, salinisation with rising sea levels, and desertification. Supplies of fresh water for agriculture are under pressure. About a third of the global population lives in arid or semi-arid areas, which cover about 40% of the land. And with global average temperatures going up, dryland areas will expand, and right now with the existing population, the populations of arid and semi-arid regions are extracting groundwater faster than it can be replenished. So we have those constraints. When it comes to that marvel of human ingenuity, well, what's in the pipeline? Barring some completely unforeseen eureka moment, what do we have to be hopeful about? First and foremost, you can point to the continuing sophistication of GPS-enabled precision farming techniques and technology. From planting to irrigation to spraying to harvesting, major advances are being made to maximise efficiency and minimise environmental impact, particularly in conjunction with pest and pathogen resistant and herbicide tolerant crops. Much of the world's agriculture is still highly inefficient compared to how it could be, so there is still a lot to play for. That said, the obstacles are considerable, because such optimization is going to need a high level of sophistication amongst farmers worldwide, and it generally works best on a large scale. Such moves are fiercely culturally resisted at the moment, with large-scale farming derided as factory farming and smallholder farming idealised as somehow being more inherently sustainable. Another trend is that high-value crops are being moved into covered environments, which can reduce water use and increase sustainability. These environments suit automation, robotics, wireless sensor systems. They're also less exposed to the vagaries of external weather events. Producing animal protein is more resource intensive, but societies coming out of poverty tend to increase meat and fish consumption, not to reduce it. Advances there are being made to increase the efficiency of these processes. And while some people believe that people will be eating insect protein as part of all this, more likely insects become food for fish protein. And there are advances there. We've been seeing initiatives such as salmon genetically modified to grow continuously rather than seasonally, which significantly reduces the time taken to market. Such fish have also been modified to be sterile, hence incapable of breeding with wild salmon. Of course, the worry people have of genetic organisms spreading throughout the natural world. In due course, the artificial culturing of animal proteins will make one of the biggest breakthroughs, starting to replace some of the most resource-intensive breeds with meat of more or less similar quality, but with a lot less of the resources. It's early days for that, in terms of a process that will scale to the extent of making any sort of global difference, but it is a clear area of potential. Here's the thing. All of those innovations tend to be of the kind that environmentalists fiercely resist, in the same way that they will argue we need to be zero carbon energy, but they will fight any suggestion that we should include nuclear power. So they seem to be inclined to make this process more difficult as well. To live sustainably within the constraints we do have, we need to produce more food on the same amount of land, using less water, energy and chemicals. It's not difficult to envisage how a world of 10 billion people could achieve this, but it's hard to see how the ideologies and preferences of today can evolve quickly enough to embrace the possibilities. If people are to die in the droughts of the 21st century, it will no doubt be blamed on climate change, which may well be an exacerbating factor, but it's more likely, as have been the famines of recent past, to be down to poor decision-making of governments and leaders. But what about Paul and Anne Ehrlich? What solutions do they propose for the population/consumption problem that they have done so much to put into a catastrophic narrative? I quote, "Perhaps a good approach would be for the United Nations to convene a global constitutional convention that would address the problem of how diverse states could organise themselves politically to address global existential problems without losing valued aspects of their individual identities." A global constitutional convention. Can't see anyone finding that even at all controversial, can you? And he goes on, "Of course, this is an ambitious undertaking and would require a considerable boost in the UN's finances, as well as general support by people everywhere, support that encourage the organisation to tackle really tough questions. And don't forget the dancing unicorns, we're going to need some of those. Even though parts of the framework for all this already exists in the United Nations, the organisation is scorned in many places, especially the United States. Some of its operations are trivial or wasteful, as is typical of all governments, and most Americans are unaware of most of its activities. Not just Americans, I would suggest. and the issues that nations must learn to face in their interactions with the UN include overpopulation and overconsumption by the rich. All in all, I'm willing to bet that innovation of the sort that we've just been discussing is 100 times more realistic than the idea that the world, as it's currently made up, is going to spontaneously embrace the idea of world government. And to do this with a view that a highly centralised and remote body would then impose population controls, even soft ones, and some sort of socialist redistributive programme targeting those considered to be too rich for their own good. That's the sort of passage that conspiracists will be pointing to in the years to come and suggesting this is the secret plan hiding in plain sight. If there's a picture anywhere of Paul Ehrlich standing next to Bill Gates or Klaus Schwab, expect it to be appearing soon on a social media feed near you. Now, it's knowing of the sort, of course. It's just a hilariously bad proposition based on some sort of idealism of what a global government, no doubt ruled by wise technocrats, would do for the planet. The possibility that such a government would royally mess up early on, because the idea it could work on the basis of imposing difficult and hard choices of the world kind of has failure built into it. And then in reaction to that, you'd end up with a Donald Trump figure being put in charge of it. That possibility doesn't seem to have crossed their minds at all. So, here's where I end up. I accept that my complacency and simply hoping that human numbers level off at a sustainable figure all on their own won't do. This is something that could be a real issue for us. Nevertheless, as societies rise from poverty and their people get control over family planning choices, we do see levelling off. We have to innovate in all the available avenues to seek to raise the constraints we undoubtedly face so that the level we naturally stabilise at without policy coercion will be supportable. Elon Musk is just wrong that everyone should go out and have more babies or else we're all doomed. We've had a rapid growth economy based on a rapid growth population. We are now at a place where we have to work out how to make this work in a new situation. Because whatever you wish would happen, populations are stabilising. It's a fact that brings some challenges, but it seems on balance to be good news. By the way, people who fear this issue do so because they're afraid it will be a factor that eventually brings about the decline of civilization. Now, that may not turn out to be true, but there are some other trends we should be aware of that could do just that. I made a video a while ago looking at these, why we're in decline and what to do about it. If you've reached this point, you might want to watch that video next.